Thank you for your remarks. I am not dead, it's good. But I will be talking, I suppose, about death quite a lot. And the opening, can you see that there? I hope it's visible to you, that the quotation there, if an infant remained unbaptized at the time of death, its soul was bound for limbo, its body, however, was bound for the Cillíní. And that was the common view of Irish society probably up to the 1920s, that children were buried separately in Cillíní's, unbaptized children, and their souls did not go to heaven or hell. They ended up in an in-between place called limbo, and that's what we'll be discussing today, those sites in particular. Okay, so what we're going to look at is at the Cillíní, what they were and when they were used, what were the traditions and the rituals around them, why were the sites chosen, the characteristics of those sites, and in the West Cork context, were they unusual in any way in West Cork, where are the sites located, and where now for these sites. So, Cillíní, what does it mean? So, Kill in the Irish is a church or a church site. If you put a neen onto it, it's small or diminutive, so the small church site. And there are different variations of it in different parts of the country, which I've listed there. But small, not just because they were generally smaller than the regular graveyard, but small or diminutive in the fact that these were not consecrated grounds. So they were a burial ground, but they were lesser than the regular burial grounds. So they were Cillíní's, lesser in that sense. And two characteristics of them is they were never consecrated and they were unauthorized. There was no body, there was no church body, no government, nothing that said put a Cillíní there. This was something that happened within the community and came of the community. So they're primarily associated with the burial of unbaptized children. But as we'll see later, it wasn't just unbaptized or newborn children were buried there. Quite often, older children and some adults were also buried in these graveyards. So the idea of having a separate graveyard for children was common in many ancient societies. The Greeks, the Romans, they all had it. But in the Christian era, it goes back, it starts really in the 400s with Augustine of Hippo. Was a saint or a great churchman in Hippo, was in northern Africa. And he came up with the concept really, or he kind of hammered home the concept of original sin. That we were all born with this sin, passed down from Adam and Eve to us. And the only way to get rid of that sin was to be baptized. And he put forward the idea that baptism should happen very quickly. Because up to then, in the church, often baptism didn't happen till you were quite old. But he put forward the idea that a child should be baptized straight away to get rid of original sin. And if you weren't baptized, he theorized you went to hell, even innocent children. Now, he did say that it was a kind of a milder form of hell, but was still hell. Now, thankfully, while original sin and baptism, child baptism, were taken on by the church, the idea of young children going to hell was not universally accepted. So the idea was kind of left open. And until the 1200s, when St. Thomas Aquinas, a Dominican monk from Italy, came up with the concept of limbo, which is a place in between. It was neither heaven or hell. And he believed that those who were not baptized but were otherwise blameless ended up in limbo. So that would be unbaptized children. Now, a couple of things about limbo that kind of surprised me, because when I was growing up, I always got this view it was a very cold, dark, horrible place. And that was not Aquinas' view of it at all. He thought it was quite a happy place. He said the only thing was there was actually a better place next door, but those there in limbo didn't even know about next door, so they were quite happy, and he had a quite positive view of limbo. And the other thing was, it was never an official doctrine of the Catholic Church that children or unbaptized people went to limbo. It was a teaching, and it was kind of the accepted, this is probably what happens. But it was never laid down in our official catechism. It was never an official doctrine, which kind of, if you went to listen to the old parish priests who went to school on Go, certainly there was no grey area there. But, in fact, there was a huge grey area. However, it didn't become the official rule of the church until the late 1560s, at the time of the Council of Trent. The Counter-Reformation was going on, and the Tridentine Church was put in place, and they had rules covering everything: what you ate, how you lived, how you died. And Canon Law 1239 stated that infants of Catholic parents who died without baptism were not to be buried in consecrated ground. And that was the first time, really, that there was a definitive law to say that. It also forbids some adult burials in consecrated ground, such as suicides and unrepentant criminals, of kind of murderers and rapists. And why Ireland at the time was at the centre of this battle between Protestantism and Catholicism. So clerics, Catholic clerics in Europe said, look, we have to get into Ireland. We have to stop, as they saw, the rot. And they sent in Jesuits and Franciscans, preachers into Ireland, to enforce these new laws. So they came in, and from then on, the idea of a separate burial, or children should not be buried in consecrated grounds, became the accepted norm from then on in Ireland. It didn't catch on that much in other parts of Catholic Europe, but it did in Ireland. So they were in use from the late 1500s right through into the early 20th century, when the practice died out. As I said, church rules said unbaptized children, suicide, murderers, but over time they expanded onto other groups which were not actually prescribed by the church. These include sailors or shipwrecked strangers or shipwrecked sailors. People didn't know, were they Catholic, were they Protestant, were they Muslim, were they pagan, what were they? So often they ended up in Cillíní. They were used in times of distress, famine, and times of flu or cholera or something like that. And even yesterday, if you attended the talk on the Spanish flu, Daniel Leary was explaining about his grandmother, and at the time, wakes and normal funeral rites were suspended, and that was 1918. So can you imagine inside the Great Famine and things like that, the normal funeral rites were suspended, and people just wanted to bury people quickly, so the Cillíní was often used. Times of conflicts, so people who were involved in battles or a war, that they died doing something, it wasn't godly what they were doing. So often soldiers or people who were involved in conflict ended up being buried in Cillíní, and there are a couple of sites in West Cork associated with battles. But also, more poignantly, handicapped people, those who were physically or mentally disabled, they were seen as probably being, cursed, really, often in society. And when they died, they weren't buried in consecrated ground. They would have been buried in the Cillíní. And some of the more extreme examples were pregnant women, or women who died in pregnancy, who died unchurched, would have been buried in Cillíní. Now, that wasn't a common practice, but in some parts of the country, it did become a practice. So a wide variety of people ended up being buried in the Cillíní. So, and I suppose this big group, though, was still children, and it wasn't just unbaptized children. Children who died, infant mortality rates in the first year of life was very high. So very often those children would have been buried in Cillíns. And in some places, children up to the age of 10 or 12 were regularly buried in Cillíns. That they had a tradition of a totally separate burial from children to adults. So when they were in use, they went out of use, from the late 19th century on, when attitudes towards burials changed. It was a time when traditional wakes and keening also died out, time when far fewer infant deaths occurred due to better medical care, and increasingly regular graveyards were used. We click on there. You might click on a couple since we're... Okay, thank you. So eventually the church did catch up with popular what was happening on the ground. There was a change in canon law in 1917 to allow for the use of what they call angel plots within graveyards, which were separated areas for these children. But the Second Vatican Council basically had a whole review of the whole church law, and gradually out of that, the canon laws that forbid the burial of unbaptized children were removed. They can now be buried in consecrated ground. There is a church ceremony for it, and the church catechism was also changed to say that Jesus stated, "Let the children come unto me, do not hinder them." Therefore, there is hope that there's a way of salvation, that children who have died without baptism. So, and it is, today, I suppose the view is that they would go to heaven rather than limbo. So we'll look at the rituals. So Cillín burials generally took place at night. It was the father, just with the aid of a male relative, who did the burial and did everything. He made the coffin, took the child to the Cillín and buried the child in the Cillín. There was no involvement from women or from the mother. It was the father's duty with the aid of male relative. And there was no religious or community involvement. It was a very quiet ceremony at night. And you can contrast that to adult burials, where there was a huge community involvement. They were waked for a number of days. There was obviously religious ceremonies performed, and women played a central role in the laying out of dead and in keening, but no role in a Cillín burial. In other ways, Cillíns were very similar to regular graveyards. The grave was marked by simple stone. Those graves were in a row, aligned east to west. In the Christian tradition, people are buried face east to see the risen Christ at the second coming. And again, in a Cillín, even though they couldn't go to heaven, they're still buried face east in the same way as a regular graveyard. Coffins were used, simple coffins made by the father, or shrouds. So again, these should always be seen as burials. They were not disposals of a body. They had a different tradition, a different ritual, but they were still burials. And another way that they were like regular graveyards is neither regular graveyards or Cillíns were visited after people died. And a lot of people comment, nobody went to see the Cillín afterwards. But there was no tradition in Ireland of visiting graveyards until relatively recently. Once you were dead and buried, that was it. There was no going back to the graveyard. In the folklore, like many other sites, bad luck was associated with those who harmed the sites, a Cillín. And sins that could happen were they were consumed by hunger. If you went into a Cillín, that you could get lost. If you damaged it, you could get skin rashes. But often, somebody damaged a Cillín, they lost the farm, or somebody died within the family was a common story. And I collected a number of those stories. One from Capaglass near Ballyhob, where two men went into a Cillín, removed a stone to build a house, and then they got up next morning, and the wall they'd built had fallen down. And they were explaining this to a neighbour, and the neighbour asked, "Where did you get the stone?" oh, we got it over there in such and such a field. And they said, that's a Cillíní. You should not have removed anything from that. Put it back and use some other stone. And they did that, and of course the next time the wall stayed up. And they're common little stories, and generally where people do harm. The other one there is from Holly Hill, out in Halfadown, and it's a different story. It was said of a very poor man who had 10 children came along one day, and he sat on the wall surrounding the Cillíní, and a rabbit appeared with a gold sovereign in its mouth, which he was rather surprised by. So he didn't say anything, and the rabbit went away, came back with another gold sovereign. And this happened for about 20 times. And then the 21st time, the rabbit came along and took away one of the sovereigns. So your man said, he gathered up what was left and went home, and the end of the story was he lived happily ever after, himself and his 10 children. What it shows me, though, is that people did not see these sites as being evil in themselves. Good things could happen there. But if you damaged them, harm would come to you. But the sites themselves were not evil, or seen as evil. So where were these sites? There were 3 broad areas where they were located, often in old churches or other sacred sites. Other ancient sites, particularly ring forts, and then the third group were none of the above, just miscellaneous. So just look at a couple of those sites. This is a couple of church sites locally. This is Ballymacrown, out towards Baltimore, and we know it's a church site because it's this lovely old cross inside in it. This is Lishina Pingna, just north of Scabreen, an old ecclesiastical site. You can see the old site there. I don't think I have a pointer in this one, but it's this area here is the Cillíní. Again, an old church site. This is a ring fort site. The ring fort here, a beautiful ring fort out in Monaghan in Halfadown. And again, this is a site associated with famine burials. And this is a non-associated site, Gortnaroo, kind of north of Ballyhob, and it's just a bit of rough ground beside a stream. And today, it's very remote, but actually you can see in the background there was actually an old road coming into this. So many sites that look remote today once were not quite remote, that there were large populations in those areas. So there are 2 theories really about how these sites were chosen. One is the liminal theory, and the other is practical. And just some of the researchers, Deirdre Crombie, Emer Denny, and Eileen Murphy, and the first 2 are very much in the liminal camp, and the last in the practical. So liminal is kind of something that's in between. Liminal kind of means a border, in between, a threshold, a marginal site. And just a couple of quotes there that Emer Denny said, these souls, like the fairies, could not enter heaven or hell. And again, ring forts would have been chosen because that's where fairies lived, and fairies couldn't enter heaven and hell like these children. And Crombie said, the marginal location reflects the sense of placelessness. So picking places like an old church, some place that was holy, but isn't holy anymore. It's kind of, it has an in-between, a liminal site, a border, a townland border. It's not here, it's not there. In between, a crossroads site, and there are many crossroads sites in West Cork. Again, crossroads, are you going this way, are you going that way? In between, a liminal site. And most of the literature would say that these are liminal or marginal sites. So they're the reasons, the crossroads, the remote sites, the boundaries. A few years ago, Eileen Murphy, who's a researcher up in Queen's University in Belfast, came along and she said, you're overthinking it completely, folks. The basic of what's happening here is parents have just lost a child. And what they want is to have that child buried somewhere that they know will not be disturbed. They're not thinking about limbo or anything like that. They're thinking very practically. So you pick a ring fort or an old church site because there's a taboo within society that you don't touch those sites anyway. So they will not be disturbed. Boundary or remote sites are used because they're not used for agricultural reasons. So these are sites that people know will not be disturbed. And also, often these remote sites or boundary sites, as people didn't own the land, the people who were burying children here weren't the landowners. They were the tenant farmers and the labourers. So you picked a bit of land that you knew would not change hands or was kind of, ownership was a bit of a grey area. So for practical reasons, you were picking those sites. And this is, I think, is probably a more accurate reason why people were picking sites. They weren't actually thinking about marginality or liminality. They were thinking practically. There are very few archaeological digs in Cillíní for a couple of reasons. Most archaeology in Ireland happens because of developments. Either a road or a new development is going on, and the archaeologists are brought in, often much to the joy of the developer, as you can imagine. And these sites seem to be far away from such developments. And also, Cillíní have often been used up to recent times. So it would not be appropriate to go in and start digging in sites that were used up to the 1920s or 30s. So very few sites have been actually excavated. But those who have, what the data has come out of them has kind of confirmed what we know from the historical records, that they were used generally from the 1600s up into the late 1800s. And just a couple of examples. One is Tony Bawn up in Mayo. And again, about 60% of the burials there were children under 2 years of age. So again, not just unbaptized children, but children in early infancy as well. And also about 9% were children slightly older, between 2 and 9. So again, this tradition that it wasn't just young children, that at times it was other children as well. Simple coffins, east-west alignment were all confirmed in that site. And the adult burials, was about 70% were children, the 30% of that were mainly in lower layers. So it shows that this was probably originally a regular graveyard and then reused later as a Cillíní. So again, confirming the historic record. The other site up in Carrowkeel in Galway is an interesting site because it showed a number of children burials earlier on in the 600s, 800s, and between the 1000s and 1200s. And it's caused a lot of debate. Some people have put forward the idea that there was already a tradition in Ireland of separate burials of children, and they point to this site and say, well, this shows that there was. Other people are saying, well, you can't read too much into one site, and it could have been, we don't know what local factors were happening. So that's an ongoing debate. Was there a tradition before the Tridentine rules came into Ireland of separate burials of children in Ireland? Debate goes on. So some of the common features of a Cillíní, and the textbooks will tell you they're enclosed by earth or stone. There's a burial area, often rows, raised, and it contains grave markers. And that is, I suppose, the classic Cillíní. And this is Mainver up in Cork parish, and it is a classic Cillíní. It has a lovely kind of earthen and stone wall around it, raised area inside with grave markers, and the obligatory at this stage couple of hawthorn trees, a beautiful site and very typical of what a Cillíní should be. This one is quite different. It's the closest one to where I live, out in Church Cross, and it's also the smallest one I've come across. It is just about 1 metre by 2 metres. Some of the boundary stones are still there, and there's a slight raised area, but no grave markers, and it was never marked in any ordnance survey map or anything. The memory of it was kept in with the local farmer, but just if you would walk by it and you would not realise it was a Cillíní. This is what most of them actually look like today, particularly in summertime. They're completely overgrown, and usually the farmers leave them, that they don't leave stock or anything into them, and they are very overgrown, the vast majority of them. One kind of different type of Cillíní, which was very common in the eastern part of West Cork, was Crossroads sites. And these are just small, usually triangular areas of land at crossroads. And they were quite different because you couldn't dig down to bury the child. So instead the child was laid on the ground and the earth was piled up around it. So there are descriptions of these of up to 5 feet high. Generations and generations of burials. The vast majority of them have disappeared because they interfered with modern traffic. So most of them are tarred over. This is only one of 2 that I know have survived. This is just north of Clonakilty town. So a common feature were grave markers, and they were usually, as I said, arranged in rows. They were roughed and uninscribed. The majority were in an east-west alignment, and sometimes they were clustered in one area of Cillíní. And this is common, that inside in a ring fort, just one section of a ring fort would be used as a Cillíní, and the rest would not. And there's no pattern. Sometimes it would be the south, sometimes north, could be, different bits. And we don't know why they just use one section and not another section. It's one of these things that we scratch our heads why that happened. This is Liminal Theory, not far from here, in a way a classic. All these rows and rows of uninscribed rough stone. A very beautiful and quite a poignant sight. And the modern cross was put there by the late John O'Sullivan, and he took it off his wife's grave. That the tradition of putting a wooden cross before you put up the stone marker. So he took the wooden cross and brought it into the Cillíní. This is Dunbeacon graveyard out near Doris, and this is a regular graveyard. And really, the only difference here, it's just rows of uninscribed marked stone. But the only difference is, here, there's about 6 and 7 feet between the rows for adult burials. And in the last picture, there's about 2 feet between the rows. So actually, before people started to put up modern headstones in old graveyards, Cillíníes and old graveyards looked very much alike. This is again what you often see, because the stones are generally quite low. When you go in, a lot of these tougher grass, if you kick at them, there are stones under them. So you go into a site and you first say, there are no grave markers here. But quite regularly, they are grave markers. This is Ardnagrana out in Ringaroga Island. This is a couple of different varieties of stones. This is back in the Ballymacrown site, and a couple of sites like this that the gravestones weren't in rows, that there were little cairns of stone, and in this one around a central pillar, and there were a few of those in the sites, and a couple of sites like that, there were cairns of stones rather than rows of stones. Again, we don't know why this happened in some sites. And this is the only inscribed stone I've found in the Cillíní so far. And it's out in the Beara Peninsula in Thornhill. And it's to Honora Sullivan, died the 9th of July, 1815, aged 3 months. So again, undoubtedly, this little girl had been baptized, but was buried in the Cillíní. And it's actually beautiful. The inscriptions it's a very fine inscribed stone, and it's the only inscription I have found. One of the questions that often asked me, what was happening in the Church of Ireland and the Protestant community? And this is a Protestant burial. Thomas Wright, age 4, died the 29th of January 1826, so roughly the same period of Henora. But this is inside in Cree, inside in the consecrated ground, and he's actually both his father and grandfather were Church of Ireland clergymen. So again, it's very common in the Church of Ireland community to see inscriptions for young children that young. So in the Church of Ireland community, children were being buried in the regular graveyards. So to sum up my work, I began my surveying back in 2013, and I first looked at comparing the local Cillíns to work that Emer Dennehy had done in South Kerry, and she had classified the Cillíns into circular shape, rectangular shape, enclosures, destroyed and all that. And you can see the ones that I surveyed, the figures are almost identical. So in this part of West Cork at least, and in South Kerry, there is no difference in the Cillíns. And also another thing I noted was they also went out of use in roughly the same time, from post-famine, from about 1850 up to 1920 they went out of use, and I found the same in this area. And one thing anomaly that Dennehy found, that there was no correlation between either population size or land mass as parasite of population in Kerry. And I found the same here, that certain parishes had huge numbers of Cillíns, others didn't. And again, we don't quite know why some areas there were large numbers and other areas there weren't. But there's no correlation between land mass or population. Work I've been doing more recently have been mapping all the Cillíns in West Cork, and there are about 300 sites, and this is the distribution of them from roughly from Kinsale to out to the Beara Peninsula. And one thing you'll notice, they are what I call islands. Don't have a pointer here now, but there's one around Skibbereen here, over around Rosscarbery, around the Manway. You get these islands, and when you look at it first, you say, oh, they're all urban areas, so there's something different happening in rural and urban. But then I mapped regular graveyards, and lo and behold, the regular graveyards nearly all pop into these islands. And it isn't just in rural areas. Up here in Cora, if I can see it from here, is this the one that's in Cora anyway, which is one of the centres of Cillíns. But around the regular graveyard, there are no Cillínis. So this is shouting out that despite all the rules of the church and everything else, people were still using regular graveyards to bury unbaptized children. And it was only when it wasn't convenient, when the regular graveyard was not close to them, that they were using Cillínis. So what exactly was happening at these sites? This is Kilnagross, quite close to Clonakilty, and there's a little triangular area here. And this was one of these crossroad Cillíns, and was there again until relatively recent times. It was removed. So close to the regular graveyard, not quite in it. And there are other traditions. In Drina, I was told, they were buried just outside at one of the walls of the graveyard. In Rosscarbery, there's a plot inside the graveyard where they're buried. But certainly, despite the official church rules, children were buried either at or very close to regular graveyards. One of the things I looked at was there a difference between the eastern part of West Cork and the western part? And certainly there's a higher density of Cillíns out here in the west. And in the west there are no crossroads sites. And I'll come back to why that is in a minute, or maybe. There are far more grave markers out here in the west, but again, it's hard to know because it can be often difficult to find grave markers. And here in the west, the sites seem to be far more remote. One of the things I notice when you're out around Clonakilty or Bandon, you get out of your car and next thing you're in the Cillíní. Whereas out here, you have to put on your Wellingtons, you have to go across a few fields to find them. But when you look at the 1842 map, often what is a remote site now were very close or central to communities back in the early 1800s. So again, I think there's an overemphasis on remoteness today that they were not remote when they were in use. And again, just briefly, a researcher, Elaine Tobin, looked at the distribution of Cillíní in North Cork, South Tipperary, to Kerry, Galway, and she found pretty much what I found between east and the west part of West Cork. There was a big difference in the number of Cillíns, and she came up with a number of reasons. The survival of sites would be one, that in rich agricultural areas, sites don't tend to survive as much as they do in areas like this. Population and wealth density. Here we'd have a far greater population density and much poorer, so there'd be more deaths in here, and people would not be able to afford kind of regular graveyards as much. Far smaller families in richer areas. And again, the one that you mightn't think of was the strength of the Catholic Church. In areas that the Catholic Church was strong, there were fewer Cillíns. You say, why? And that's because in those areas, it was only those who were prescribed by canon law were buried in Cillíns. Where along here, where the church was not as strong, it had expanded out to include other children and other groups of people. But where the church was actually strong, none of that was happening. So where the church was strong, there were fewer Cillíns. And again, just looking at the map of Cork, all of Cork this time, and looking at Cillíns, and showing that distribution. In the eastern one-third, there are practically no Cillíns. In the middle, there are a good few Cillíns, but the real concentration is down here in the west. Huge difference, actually, between the east and west of the county. If you look at the regular graveyards, it's the complete opposite. Big concentration in the east, good few in the middle. Down here, very few. Again, showing that where there were regular graveyards, people were using them. And Cillíns seem to exist where there weren't an abundance of regular graveyards. So why is this? Regular graveyards there was one basically for every parish. So in West Cork, this is a map of the old parishes. In the eastern part, you can see loads of them, all stuck in together. Out here in the west, much bigger areas. The Norman Conquest. The Normans came as far as Rosscarbery, Glandore. The parishes were created in the 1200s, around the time of the Norman Conquest. Where the Normans were strong, they were done on Norman land territories, which were smaller and more higgledy-piggledy. Out here in the west, there's the Gaelic chieftains, much larger areas under the chieftainship. The parishes are much bigger. So you get far more regular graveyards in the east than you do in the west. Another thing, beyond Leap, no crossroads sites. Over here in the old Norman territories, quite common. My theory on this was that in medieval Europe, there was a tradition of executions at crossroads, suicides were buried at crossroads. So this tradition probably came into the Norman area from medieval Europe. Whereas in the west, where the Gaelic lords, there wasn't that tradition of the use of crossroads that way. So in the west, no crossroads sites. In the east, quite a number of them, all down to the Normans. One of the things I'm doing at the moment is going through the School Folklore Commission, which is now online and looking for folklore that was recorded of these sites. And there isn't a lot, but generally when it comes up, they can be very informative. And this is just one of Cillíní West site that was used in the time of the famine. So trying to figure out what and when sites were being used, it's a fantastic resource, and that's an ongoing work that I'm undertaking at the moment. So where are we with Cillíní today? One of the things I noticed doing my survey is that there's actually a very high awareness in communities of the location of Cillíní, and there is a high respect for those sites. Farmers generally fence them off and don't leave cattle into them. So that is very, I suppose, encouraging. Sites, as I say, are generally overgrown and uncared for. In recent years, there's been a far greater media awareness of them. A number of sites have been cleaned, and site surveys have been done on them. Excavations have happened, so we know much more in recent years than we did maybe 5-10 years ago. And that's important because land ownership is changing, and a huge amount of the land in Ireland at this time is owned by quite old people, many of them bachelors. And when the new generation come in, that will be sold on to people who might have no connection with the land. So the old of handing down from father to son, that bit of knowledge that over in the corner of the field there, don't touch it. That will be lost in a lot of cases in the next 20, 30 years. So it's important that we now record these sites and we know where they are so that they're not destroyed. Some sites have been reclaimed and consecrated, and masses happen in them. And there is, however, as I said, a problem of ongoing destruction of sites, because sometimes it is accidental, people just don't know, and other times there is very little legal protection in Ireland for any historical site. So if you go in and destroy Cillíní, pretty much, I'm afraid, nothing will happen to you. This is the site out on Hare Island, which has been cleaned, reclaimed, a cross put up, and once a year, on the 3rd Sunday of August, a Mass is held there. So we probably won't make it, but I think 2:30 today is the annual Mass in the Cillíní in Hare Island. So, in conclusion, I want to thank everyone who helped me, particularly landowners who gave me access, and everyone who came forward to information during the course of my work. New information is always welcome, and it is important, as I said, that we record and protect these sites. So before I hand over to any questions, I just always use this quote to end this talk, and it comes from Derek Mahan's poem, The Disused Shed. They are begging us, you see, in their wordless way, to do something, to speak on their behalf, or at least not to close the door again. Thank you. Much on that.